Well, it's nice to see the place full of, when I first arrived here it was a bit empty, but it's filled out nicely, so welcome everybody to Queensland, for those of you who haven't already been welcomed. I am a local, but I'm going to be talking, this talk is going to be an attempt to be as inclusive as possible, so it won't be data heavy or whatever, it will be more conceptual. I'm a computational neuroscientist, and I'm trying to communicate some ideas which, you know, I think have implications for behavioural studies and philosophical studies of perception, if not consciousness, probably both. So first of all, let me start by saying what I mean by perceptual warping. Anyone who studies perception will be aware that our internal percept is really only a fairly loose approximation of what's really going on out there in the real world. And it's built on a series of assumptions, and those assumptions can get us into trouble just occasionally. So situations like the Ames room that people will be familiar with. In this case, we're making some assumption on the basis of a linear perspective, assuming this room is square when it isn't. So this little person here is actually, of course, the same person, just moved across here, but they've actually moved closer to you, but your eye doesn't see it that way. There are other types of sort of more basic illusions, size contrast illusions. This orange disk is actually the same size in both cases, but by being surrounded by larger disks, this appears relatively small compared to this circle here. Now those are built on assumptions, and that's not the sort of thing that I'm talking about when I'm talking about warping. I'm talking about these are mistakes built on assumptions, the brain trying to do the best it can with limited or ambiguous information. What I'm talking more about is thinking about what the reason, you know, what perception is for. And if you believe Gibson, which to some extent I think one can, then perception is there in order for us to act in a sensible way. And of course that means that some of our cortical representations must be correct, you know, except under certain special circumstances. Generally speaking, we must have an accurate representation, but if you listen to Mel Goodale and his colleagues, that may not have anything, in fact, to do with perception. In other words, we may have a system that is good for doing motor behavior like interception, obstacle avoidance tasks, whatever, but that may not actually be what perception is all about, because he would argue for a dissociation between the things we're conscious of and things that we perceive and representations that we use to act. What I'm actually arguing for, and this is what I mean by perceptual warping, is that our percept is designed to be of use to us, and if it distorts the way the world is represented, but does so in a way that's advantageous to driving behavior, then that's fine. So there may be situations in which distortions are advantageous, because they exaggerate differences at a category boundary, for example. If I need to decide, is this thing poisonous or not poisonous, it's very important to be able to make a dissociation across that boundary, but I don't care if it's poisonous type A or B, I just don't want to eat it, or if it's not poisonous, well, maybe that doesn't matter for that decision. I just need to make a decision, should I be eating it or not? And there is evidence for this. One of the areas where it's been studied quite a lot is in categorization of things like male, female, faces. This is actually another study looking at distinguishing famous faces. And this whole field has been termed categorical perception, because what they find is that for certain categories anyway, if you look at this continuum, this is going from a female face obviously to a male face. If you ask people to distinguish these two faces, maybe they're shown this face and then they're shown these two and asked which one did you just see, they're not very good at it. Whereas an equivalent step in terms of the amount of pixels that are changing, close to the category boundary, produces much more sensitive responses. So that's what's going on here. This is the category boundary where you're saying, this would be equivalent to female switching over to male decisions as you're moving along this continuum. And at the point of the category, that's where you get the best discrimination performance. In other words, you can tell these two apart better than you can, say, these two or these two. And that's in terms of reaction times and also accuracy. But don't don't let me leave you thinking that this is restricted to humans. In fact, it was originally described in crickets, I think, categorical perception. This is an example of some little fish which my wife and I worked on. We asked ourselves whether a simple, relatively simple organism, a lower vertebrate like this, might also be capable of categorical perception. Just trying to get down to the basics of it. I mean, do we need a complex brain, or do we have a kind of fairly simple brain exhibit these types of behaviours? These might look very similar to you, but to this fish they don't, because these fish have little UV patterns that, of course, human visual system can't pick up on. You play the same game where you basically create a continuum between one species and another species. So these are two species of damselfish. And obviously that matters to this fish, because he doesn't want to go chasing around the wrong species. He wants to know that it's a conspecific rather than a heterospecific. And sure enough, what you find is improved performance in the boundary between the mid-range between one species of face pattern and another. So if this categorical perception seems to span across different species. Now, those of you who know anything about categorical perception will know that there are some problems in all of this. When people were originally talking about categorical perception, one of the things they talked about was things like the rainbow. Now, it's an example of where perception doesn't really follow physics. If you think about it, there's a smooth continuum running from long wavelength to short wavelength light here, and yet we perceive bands of colour. And so this was taken as an example of categorical perception. For some reason, we're turning something which is a smooth continuum into discrete buckets of colour. And it was argued for sound as well. But as I say, if you read the literature, then of course what you have to be aware of is the fact that our visual system doesn't treat the visible spectrum in a simple linear way. It bites chunks out of it using our photoreceptors. And sound too is based on a series of samples. And so it could be that categorical perception is not really an adaptive process at all. What's really going on is we just have a non-linear sensory system that's converting all this stuff into, creating these kind of artifacts, if you like. Well, the best way of solving that debate is actually to look at learning and say, well, is there a situation where you can show a bunch of stimuli and there's no categorical perception, but then with enough exposure and learning and training on performing a categorization task that categorical perception emerges? And the short answer, because I'm going to run out of time otherwise, is yes. So here is an example of where the visual system basically what they had to do was they used these novel objects. So you go from a bottle to a lamp or something like that, and they've done it with individuals, face recognition and so forth. You get this peak in discrimination performance at the boundary between the two categories. So as an example of where the visual system is apparently able to learn to create heightened sensitivity to a category boundary, which is it's not a veridical representation of what's out there. The brain is warping that space around the region which is of most interest behaviourally. So that's between categories. I'm now going to talk briefly about within categories and talk about the effects of expertise and exposure. This is an extremely well-studied phenomena. If you take a bunch of Caucasians and you ask them to discriminate a bunch of Caucasian faces, they perform at a certain level in terms of reaction times and so forth, and you show them then faces from some other part of the world, and their performance is worse. And then you take people from, in this case, Southeast Asia, and you ask them to do exactly the same discrimination task on exactly the same stimuli, then suddenly their performance is better on their own race than it is on another race. And this isn't a genetic thing, because if you happen to be a Caucasian raised in Southeast Asia, you're better at Southeast Asian faces than you are at Caucasian ones. So it's an environmental effect. And this is actually rather a nice paradigm, potentially, for studying how visual representations come about, because this seems to be, it's clearly evidence of the capacity of the visual system to develop highly attuned discrimination performance for stimuli with which you are familiar and you get a lot of exposure, and worse performance for stimuli that you spend less time looking at. And this feels very adaptive. I mean, it makes sense that you should use your neural resources to do fine-level discrimination on things that you get exposed to a lot and not on things that you don't spend much time looking at. I don't have a huge amount of time to go into the model, but basically I'm going to take now, there's not really any need on, this is a model of object recognition. I'm going to look at what standard models of object recognition, biologically inspired models do. And basically, now let's think of these as a space in which we have, we've represented faces across 2 dimensions, and these dimensions are somewhat arbitrary. They could be, to make it easier for you to conceptualize this, let's say this is hair length and nose size or something, but it could be anything. And these bunch of faces fall within that, fall somewhere along that, along those 2 dimensions. In this case, there's more variation, physical variation in nose than hair length, for example. If you have just a little collection of neurons that are looking at that in a competitive network of the type we think is what we have in object recognition, basically what the neurons do is they organize themselves along this first principal component. And this system is still learning, it's still dynamic, but it's actually quite stable because when these faces are being presented, it's doing its learning, and what it does is it divides the space up in this manner. So any of the faces here would activate that neuron more strongly than any of the faces within this region would activate that neuron more strongly. So these 6 neurons have divided up the space. When you spend a lot of time looking at something, more and more neurons naturally get drawn into that space because that's a region of space in which there's lots of action, lots of inputs. And simple Hebbian association mechanisms would argue that this is what happens. You get more neurons dragged in. And what you find is that neurons then no longer simply sit along the first principal component. They start to get pushed off this axis by their neighbouring neurons. And you get a more finely discriminated space in which you could tell the difference now between a person with that hair length and nose size, and that person with that hair length and nose size, whereas here, nose size has almost been completely ignored by the system. So what about the other race effect? How does that look? Well, here we've got a whole bunch of faces that appear along some dimensions or other to be centered about this point, and this would be our own race. Then we see fewer versions of another face, a set of faces from another race. And simply because there are fewer examples being presented here, fewer neurons go into that region of space, and lots and lots of neurons get drawn into this region of space. And this is, as I say, this system is simply organizing itself along simple Hebbian principles. And what you end up with is a space that looks like this. You'll notice that the regions of action, the regions of selection of neurons, is much, much bigger in the other race space than they are in the own race space. So what are the consequences of that? Basically, if we look at the own race space and the other race space, how far, this is a measure of how far can I move away from a fixed point in that space, so in a particular face, and the neural representation changes. And for the same race faces, because you've got so many of these face boundaries close to one another, you don't move very far in that space, and you're getting a different type of representation coming out. Whereas in the other race face, you have to move a long way to get a change in the neural output. Another way to think about that is if I go along the continuum of my own race, I've got lots of neural classifiers all tightly, with these sort of Gaussian tuning functions, perhaps all tightly close together. In the own race space, they're more broadly tuned. And if I put in a stimulus at this point somewhere along the continuum and another one, they have to do a discrimination, that's relatively easy because very different neural responses are coming out. Whereas here, for exactly the same physical change in stimulus, there's almost no change potentially in the neural output. So this is the own race. You get very little overlap in the neural outputs. So think of this as the center point of the neural activity. and it looks very different for this other stimulus at this point, whereas in the own race space, they look very similar. I won't talk about caricatures because I don't have time. Basically, let me summarize by saying what I think is going on is that repeated exposure to a particular set of stimuli produces neurons that are highly selective, and they get crushed in by all these other neurons, and they produce these representations which exhibit very narrow tuning across specific stimulus dimensions. These neurons integrate information across multiple stimulus dimensions, which means that they actually start to produce what in the face literature they call holistic representations. And it turns out that this can actually explain, within the face recognition literature, explain a lot of effects. But in terms of this issue that I'm referring to today, this perceptual warping, what a self-organizing system does is it chooses the appropriate compromise between high discrimination, poor generalization. In other words, if I show a face and I show a slightly different version of that face, the neural representation changes a lot if I'm in an area of expertise. The alternative is that I'm in an area of not very good expertise. I have poor discrimination performance, but good generalization. Now, the reason why that's useful is that the neural system is an emergent property of a self-organizing neural system of this kind, is that you have extremely good, really fine discrimination performance, and you have to think of it in terms of the neural pattern that emerges for very, very small changes in stimulus changes a lot, So it's not that when we become an expert at something, we perceive changes, minor changes, as very significant because the neural output of our system is changing a lot. Whereas in regions where we're not experts, substantial physical changes in the stimulus might only produce very small changes in the neural output. But we're not experts, and maybe all we're interested in is saying, oh yeah, well that's cars or that's trees, or rather than that's a Ford Falcon, or that's breaking it down into its finer details. It's all about what's behaviourally relevant. The things that we spend a lot of time looking at are the things that we end up with this super fine discrimination performance for. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Okay, so we have time for one or two quick questions, depending on the length of the question. Any questions for Goss? Yes.
So the first few slides suggested that the face discrimination would be at the boundary between categories, but your models would have face discrimination within.
Yeah, no, you're right. So you have to postulate another system. So basically what you have is, the second half of my talk is talking about expertise. So the fact that you spend a huge amount of time looking at something, you end up with very fine discrimination performance within that category. But if you're talking about sort of between categories, in other words, faces and cars or something like that, then you have to have a system that's making that categorization choice. So you have to have a final arbitration system. And basically, I have a paper on that as well, if you like, but you have to have a system that's looking at the output of a system like this, that's making a decision about whether this falls into one category or another. And so you're right, the model is, as I've explained it there, is one about expertise, really. It would need another layer to explain between category behavior.
Super fast final question is the one. Yes.
For example, the working hypothesis in psychology, I think this would be a nice sort of detailed explanation of how that works.
Yeah, I think so.
So it just goes and see 30 different shades of snow.
Yeah. No, I think some things are genetically predetermined, but it's amazing how much a little self-organizing system can do. You just leave it to run, and it makes its own decisions about what's important or not. And if it sees a huge number of faces of the same race, then it thinks that's significant, and it basically expands that region of object space just of its, in and of itself. It doesn't need to be told to do that. It's just a property of a self-organizing system. All right.
Speaker is Peter Koch from Radboud University in Nijmegen. and will be speaking about shape perception and primary visual cortex.
Thank you all for being here. Yeah, like just said, I'd like to talk about effects of shape perception on activity in primary visual cortex. So when we think about the visual world, there's some hierarchical structure to it. So in the example shown here of this, there's a scene here that's composed of individual shapes or objects, and these larger shapes or objects are again composed of more simple shapes or features and angles and such. And this hierarchy in the visual world is mirrored by a hierarchy in cortex, where in the visual cortex there are different areas responding to larger and more complex features, such as area IT, and lower level regions like V1, which respond to small regions of visual space and relatively simple features. Traditionally, this hierarchy has been thought of as like kind of a feed-forward hierarchy, but of course we know that there's a lot of recurrent processing going on, where these higher order areas also feed back signals to these lower order areas. And when you think of an example like this, it makes sense to think of the fact that, for example, here, recognizing this car shape, which may be done in an area like LOC, helps it identify the features in this small region of the object. So the horizontal and vertical lines here may be kind of brought out more by feedback from LOC to V1. V1 with this feedback may know that these edges are more reliable than some other edges that may also be present. So the question is, does shape perception modulate activity in early regions like V1? Well, there is certainly evidence to that effect. There are studies that show that perceiving a shape reduces the activity in V1. For example, this study by Scott Murray and colleagues, where they show that when you compare objects or images that go from either being random lines to shapes, that as there's more shape information in the stimulus, area LOC, which is sensitive to shapes, increases activity, and V1 decreases activity. There are also studies that find the opposite effect of shape perception in V1. For example, this study by Zoe Kurtz's group, where all these oriented segments can either form collinear contours, such as here, or not. And these collinear contours lead to more activation in early visual regions as well as in later regions like LOC. So it seems that shape perception does modulate activity in early visual regions, but in which way is not quite clear, because there seem to be some opposing reports. So one hypothesis you might have is that the effect of these top-down shape predictions depends on the match or mismatch with the bottom-up input, or another way to phrase it is the prediction error. So this is a hypothesis that is inspired by predictive coding theories of perception. I'll explain to you a little bit more what I mean by that. Based on this, you would expect that expected signals would be inhibited. So a signal in V1 that is expected based on the shape prediction would be inhibited, and an unexpected signal in V1 would be excited by a top-down prediction that does not match it, and the same would go for an unexpected absence of a signal in V1, for example. So there are some hints out there that something like this may be happening. This is a study from Frank Tong's lab, where they looked at visual illusion, which is induced by drifting gratings. In this left panel, the drifting gratings, and what you see when you look at this stimulus when it's actually moving is that here in this gap region, the vertical lines kind of continue. There's an illusion that these are long vertical lines that span across this gap. And in this stimulus, that's not the case. And this may be because here, neurons in a higher order visual region with large receptive fields sensitive to vertical lines may be partly activated by these two segments, and then kind of detect a long vertical line here, and then send feedback to earlier regions like V1. And here there is no such long continuous line segment. what they looked in this study, they looked at the response in V1 and other early visual regions sensitive to this gap region. And they found that there's an increase in activity here in this left panel compared to this right panel. The bars here are subtractions in this condition minus this condition. So they found an increased response when there's an illusion here compared to when there's not. And in terms of this hypothesis, this may reflect an unexpected absence of signal in this location. A higher order region may detect a long continuous line segment and send feedback of that back to V1, but V1 doesn't get input here, so there's a mismatch. They also looked at the region of V1 and other early visual cortex that responded to the different gratings themselves, and there they did not find such an increase. In fact, they found a hint of a decrease. So here, a higher level feedback about a long continuous vertical segment may be said to be consistent with the bottom-up input. So it's an expected signal in this case. And there is, like I said, a hint of maybe some inhibition there. But it's not quite clear. In the study describing now, we looked at a visual illusion as well, but the one that is, to our minds, slightly more straightforwardly hierarchical. This is a Caniza illusion, a very famous stimulus, where it seems like there is a white triangle overlaying 3 black circles. So receptive fields in V1 only detect small parts of this stimulus, but a higher order region like IT may have cells that respond to a larger area and detect the triangle and send feedback back to early visual areas. And in that case, if the hypothesis is true, then here there is an unexpected absence of signal, because a higher order region detects the triangle here, but V1 neurons with receptive fields here would detect nothing. And here there is a signal, a bottom-up signal that is consistent with a higher level prediction. So to look into this, we did an fMRI study where we compared the activity evoked by such Caniza stimuli, such as here, compared to control stimuli. These were presented in a block fashion with this Caniza configuration here, presented for 500 milliseconds, and then alternated by 4 whole black circles, which give the impression of the Caniza triangle appearing and disappearing continuously. And every now and again, the 4 Pac-Mans would be oriented such that there seems to be an illusory diamond. In half of the experiment, subject's task was to detect this illusory diamond. So they had their attention, you could say, on the configuration of the Pac-Man. In the other half of the experiment, they did a task on these tiny letters here, which I'm not sure you'll be able to see well from back there. There were green letters in this bullseye, the fixation bullseye. Throughout the experiment, they were told to fixate there. And when the letter was an X or a Z, they pressed the button. So in that case, the Pac-Man were completely irrelevant to the subject's task. So we made a simple contrast between these Caniza like stimuli and the control stimuli, and looked at the activity here in this case in V1. And we see a kind of a patchy pattern of increases in some areas of V1 represented in red and decreases in others in blue. This is for one subject, which is, this pattern is hard to make sense of as it is. So what we did is we used population receptive field mapping to get a better idea of what this activity represents. This means that we presented subjects with moving bars. These bars move across the screen in 8 different directions. And then based on every voxel's response to these moving bars, we can calculate what the receptive field of each voxel is in terms of its x and y coordinate in space and in terms of the size of the receptive field. And what we found is these receptive fields had characteristics that match quite closely what is found in literature. Namely that the receptive field size increases from low visual region like V1 to higher ones, V2, V3, and so forth. And also receptive fields increase with eccentricity, with receptive field size. And we also found that there are more voxels with a receptive field close to the fovea, these crosshairs, than in the periphery. So the receptive field measurement yielded some results that are in quite close correspondence with literature. so each of these voxels here in V1, we measure the contrast between these two conditions. Are they more active or less active when there's an illusion present or when there's not? And we know their receptive field characteristics. Now we can simply, for each voxel, multiply these two and sum them up. And then we get a representation of this bold activity in visual space. So here in the middle of the visual field we see an increase for this one subject. That's roughly where the illusion is. And we see decreases around it, so roughly where the Pac-Man are. When we do this for all subjects in the experiment, all 20 subjects, we get a pattern that looks a bit like this. And the white dotted line indicates the location of the illusory triangle. So we see an increase of activity for the illusory triangle surrounded by decreases. And we see a similar pattern for also for the other three possible illusory triangle configurations. Every time it seems like there's an increase at the location of the illusory triangle, surrounded by three blobs of deactivation where the Pac-Man are that induce that illusion. So when we collapse over these four kinesia types, we get something like this, and the contours here indicate pixels that are significantly different from zero. And this reconstruction of bold activity is what we obtained for the figure task. So when people actually pay attention to the configuration of the Pac-Man, so when they had to report the illusory diamond. But when they did the other task, where they attend to the letters and completely ignore the Pac-Man, we find almost exactly the same pattern. So this effect of this high-level shape prediction or shape perception, it seems to be independent of the task people are doing and independent of whether the illusion and the Pac-Man were relevant to subjects' tasks or not. So when we do the analysis slightly differently, slightly more standard analysis you might say, we get these results. So when we look at when we simply mean over all voxels with a receptive field here in the middle of the display where the illusion takes place, and then we see more activity for these voxels when the illusion is present compared to when it's not. And when we do the same for voxels with receptive fields on the Pac-Man that induce the illusion, we find the opposite. There's more activity when there's no illusion than when there is an illusion. So what we conclude from this is that top-down shape predictions simultaneously up and down regulate activity in V1. And whether this is an up or down regulation seems to depend on whether the shape prediction is met with consistent bottom-up input or not. This is in line with predictive coding theories of perception. And this up and down regulation, depending on whether predictions match or mismatch bottom-up input, is consistent with effects of predictions in other contexts. For example, in this study, we looked at something completely different, where subjects had a prediction on which orientation an upcoming grating would have, and when the grating that is shown matches their prediction, we see less activity than when the grating has an orientation that does not match their expectation. And then in this study by Anna Todorovic in our lab, she reported that auditory tones, for auditory tones that are unexpectedly omitted, there's more activity than when no tone was expected. So an unexpected omission also leads to an increase in activity. So these two effects in very different paradigms seem to also reflect this effect of dependency on mismatch or match with bottom-up input. So this suggests, all these things together, that the brain performs some kind of hierarchical perceptual inference. So I'd like to thank all the people in our lab group, particularly Floris, who is my supervisor in all this work. And I'd like to direct your attention to Alexa St. John Southink, who will have a talk this afternoon in the session on predictive processes. It showed you some effects of expectations here that seem to be independent of the task people are doing, but this does not always seem to be the case. And Alexa will talk about how task domains can modulate the effects of perceptual expectations in early visual cortex. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, yes.
Thank you. Very nice talk. I'm wondering how you can rule out the effect of just a great big potential capture to the location of the. So obviously people are doing the letter task, but there's still going to be highly salient bottom-up concept capture adaptation, and I wonder how
So you mean that the illusion would capture attention, correct? Yeah, so in that case we would expected that would occur, that and then at least the effect would be modulated by the task that they're doing, that this attentional capture would be more present than when they're actually attending to the Pac-Man than when they're doing a distracting letter task. And in the control experiment we had manipulated the difficulty of the letter task. We had an easy version of it and a difficult version of it. And then again, we found no modulation with attentional capture. One other thing is that we compared behavioral performance on the letter detection task. If their attention is captured by the illusory triangle away from the letters, then we would expect that they would become worse at the letter detection task itself, especially in this hard letter detection that we did in the control experiment. But we found no such effect. They were just, behavioral performance was just as good in trials where there was an illusory triangle compared to in trials where there's no illusory triangle.
I guess I was thinking a better way of doing it would be to ramp on the onset of your illusion figure, just to avoid the capture.
Okay, instead of having a sudden onset, a more gradual onset. Okay, that's an interesting suggestion.
Just to double check. So the black triangles are mostly the same on each presentation, right? So you get more adaptation, more fMRI adaptation from those because less change, sort of a double amount of change in the illusory triangle. So when you expect some kind of fMRI adaptation for the surround and not for the interior, did I misunderstand the sequence that I'm seeing?
So there could be more adaptation or fatigue or something for the neurons with the receptor field on the Pac-Man compared to the neurons with the receptor field on the illusory triangle. But that would be true for both trials with an illusion and trials without an illusion. So I think that I don't think that could explain the effects we present here, if I understand your question correctly.
So I think we'll move on now. Let's thank our speaker again. So our next speaker is Q Feng Fu, whose name I've probably butchered terribly, from the Key State Laboratory of Brain and Cognitive Science in China. She's going to talk to us about the neural correlates of subjective awareness and natural scene categorization.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, my name is special, so Qiu Fangfu, very good. Your pronunciation. So it's well known that people could categorize nature scenes quickly and accurately. For example, people could report whether the image, whether the image contains animals in like needs only 62 milliseconds, and another one like only 231 milliseconds. The mean reaction time in this task is only 288 milliseconds. It's really fast. So the challenge is to explain how the rapid nature scene categorization takes place in the human brain. An important finding is that the human brain needs only 150 milliseconds to decide whether the image contains animals or not. It is the case for both fast trials and slow trials. This implies that lots of processing has been completed before this time. Given the large number of processing stages in primate visual system, the authors suggest that these processes was mainly based on feed-forward processing. However, recently, Lam argued that recurrent processing was necessary and sufficient for consciousness. He divided into feed-forward processing in two stages. In stage 1, there is a shallow feed-forward processing. The stimulus is unattended and masked. so the information can't reach to the ventral stream hierarchy. It is invisible. In stage 2, the stimulus was attended, yet masked. So the information travels from sensory to motor and prefrontal areas. It can influence people's behavior, like in priming, but it's invisible. He also divided the recurrent processing into 2 stages. In stage 3, there is a localized recurrent processing. In this stage, the stimulus get enough time to evoke recurrent processing, yet unattended. So it lacks representations in iconic memory. In stage 4, there is a widespread recurrent processing. The stimulus get enough time and attended, so it lacks representation in working memory. It's consciously. He argued that only in the stage 4, the perception is conscious. Recent ERP findings give evidence for his argument. For example, Koivisto and colleague listed 3 components related to subjective awareness. Of the 3 components, VAN and LP were the most consistently observed. The VAN's time window and scalp distribution was perfectly consistent with the stage 3, and the LP was consistent with the stage 4. Unfortunately, there's no evidence about rapid nitrogen categorization on subjective awareness. Another study used color photographs and line drawings of 6 nitrogen categories. The line drawings were produced by trained artists by tracing the contours in the color photographs. So each color photograph is corresponded with each line drawings. When people saw the images, their neural activity was recorded by function MRI. They found when decoding nitrogens from neural activity generated by line drawings was just as accurately as decoding neural activities generated by line drawings. So the results show that the line drawings and color photographs generated similar activity. So our study was aimed to investigate the ERP correlates or subjective awareness for nitrogen categorization of line drawings and color photographs. ERPs were recorded during a backward masking categorization task. Participants were asked to report the awareness on the perceptual awareness scale. Based on lambda theory, if feed-forward processing reflected in the early components, we assume that P1 and N1 might show different patterns on PAS, perceptual awareness scales, for color photographs and line drawings. The early components wouldn't be correlated with subjective awareness. If recurrent processing reflected in the later components, the VAN and LP might show similar patterns on PAS for color photographs and line drawings. That is, the later components were correlated with subjective awareness. We also used color photographs and line drawings. Sorry, they are not clear maybe. And the materials are identical to the previous one. On each trial, there was a image appeared on the screen. The time is 30 milliseconds. After that, there was a variable SOA, then the mask. After the mask, there was a blank for 500 milliseconds. Then the six category names were appeared on the screen. The location for 6 names were randomly assigned on each file. So before this screen, people couldn't prepare for their reaction. After the participants gave the response, they were asked to report how clearly they saw about the image on the PAS scale. The behavior data showed people gave less brief glimpse and more absolutely clear experience for the color photographs than line drawings. That is, people like the surface information was helpful for conscious sensation to arise. Despite this, for each awareness ratings, there was no significant differences on accuracy between color photographs and line draws. The ERP data showed that the N1 was changed. The N1 potential changed with awareness ratings only for color photographs, but not for line draws here. For VAN and IOP, the two components potentials both varied with awareness ratings for both color photographs and line draws. So the results were consistent with our expectation. That is, the early component were not correlated with awareness, just the later components correlated with awareness. Moreover, we found corresponded with the occipital effects, there were also frontal-central effects. The P2 changed with awareness ratings only for color photographs, while the N2 and P3 varied with awareness ratings for both color photographs and line draws. And the pattern at frontal-central electrodes was opposite with the occipital electrodes. The ERP difference here shows that there were significant differences on N2 and VAN between the continuous awareness ratings, but there was only significant difference between glimpse and no experience on P3, on N2, but not on P3A. And there were significant differences among other comparisons on LP, but not on P3A. Here is the mean amplitudes of each component. From the figure, we can see the N1, P1, and P2 were not consistently correlated with awareness ratings. The VAN and N2 consistently correlated with awareness ratings in a linear manner. The LP and P3A correlated with awareness ratings with a nonlinear manner. Here is the scalp distribution. From this figure, we can see the N1 effect had the similar distribution as N2. Just N1, the time window for N1 is earlier than P2. This is consistent with feed-forward processing. Also, N2 and CVA and P3A and LP have the similar scalp distribution. Just N2 and P3A were earlier than CAV and LP. These patterns were consistent with recurrent processing. Thus, our results showed that surface information was helpful conscious sensation to arise, and it didn't influence accuracy for awareness ratings at each awareness ratings. The early components reflected feedback processing and didn't correlate with awareness ratings. Didn't correlate with awareness. The later components such as N2, VAN, and LP reflecting recurrent processing and changed with awareness ratings for both color photographs and line drawings. These results confirming recurrent processing from consciousness. Further, we found that N2 and VAN had a linear correlation with consciousness, and so did the accuracy for awareness ratings. So the results were mainly consistent with graded consciousness theory. In conclusion, with our results suggest that N2, VAN, and LP reflecting recurrent processing was correlated with subjective awareness for Nicholson categorization. That's all. Thank you.
So, questions?
I wondered why you concluded that N1 did not show a correlation with subjective awareness, because you clearly found a correlation with subjective awareness for the color photographs.
Yeah.
It didn't work for the line drawings. So,
This is the problem why N1 was not correlated with conscious awareness, because compared with line drawn, the color photographs had many features like colors, textures, contours, but for line drawn, just contours information. So there was much information integration for the color photographs when people see the color photographs. That's in our mind, the N1 might correlated with feature analysis or feature integration, but no, not correlated with the really subjective awareness. If it is really correlated with subjective awareness, there should be N1 component for line drawings. Yeah, yeah.
So
Yes.
we might have to talk about this later.
Okay, thank you. Also, there are really some publications found N1 was correlated with awareness. Just they use the one kind of materials, so it's not general. Yeah.
Questions? Maybe I'll ask a final question. In terms of the later components like N2, the interpretation of these as reflecting feedback as opposed to just a change in modulation at a later time step. Why feedback? Why, without the spatial resolution,
Yeah,
how do we know it's feedback?
it's feed forward. You mean, would you say it again?
So like the N2 component.
N2 component, yeah.
So you say this is consistent with the recurrency hypothesis, but why interpret that as recurrency as opposed to just a modulation that takes place later in time at a single stage?
You mean N2 components?
Yeah. I mean, all of these.
Yeah, why this component was consistent with recurrent processing,
Yeah.
not just feed forward?
Mm.
Yeah, this is a good question. Also, we are wondering about this. Our evidence is just the N2 components like corresponded with CAV. If we saw the ERP, the ERP components, you can say the N2 just to have the opposite pattern with the CAV. Just the N2 components the time window for N2 was earlier than CA wave. Like N2 was correlated with CA wave, just like modulate CA wave in our mind, but we haven't like other more solid evidence for this. Just a suggestion. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.
And we're just going to do a quick technology change over here. We've lost our VGA. You don't look. Great. So our next speaker is Robert O'Shea, who's going to be talking about predicting visual consciousness from brain activity, the role of noise and adaptation. Dr. O'Shea comes to us from Southern Cross University here in Australia. So.
Hello, everybody. So, as the title said, we were on the quest to look for brain activity that predicts visual consciousness. And the model of visual consciousness that we used was binocular rivalry. So I guess I'm kind of among the faithful here, and I don't need to explain binocular rivalry, but just in case, binocular rivalry involves presenting different images to the two eyes. For example, horizontal contours to one eye and vertical contours to the other. And immediately one turns on a rival stimulus, one sees both of them for about 150 milliseconds. But very quickly, after 150 milliseconds, one or the other will emerge into consciousness, and the other one will become completely invisible. So it's quite a remarkable phenomenon. And if that's not remarkable enough, then after a short while, a few seconds, the one that you're seeing disappears, and the one that you haven't been seeing reappears or emerges into consciousness. And those alternations in consciousness continue for as long as you're happy to look at them. So we have a theory of binocular rivalry, and I'm a simple soul, so I have a very simple theory that was put forth by William McDougall in 1901, and it is that you have two populations of neurons that are responsive, that are processing the two images in binocular rivalry, and that those populations are linked by reciprocal inhibitory connections. So once one population gains any slight advantage because of positive feedback, you will get a very rapid excitation of that population and inhibition of the other population, which in turn reduces the inhibition that it has on the first population, and so on. So this property of the theory explains why we see one rather than two. And McDougall said, and the reason why it changes is because of adaptation. So one of the populations is working hard and to take a very simple model of adaptation, it's getting tired out. Meanwhile, the other population is resting and recovering its strength, as it were, and after a while it can spring up and then bestow very strong inhibition on the other one. So this is a very simple theory, and we thought we could use this theory to try and predict visual consciousness. One of the things we know about adaptation is if you have high activity in a population, then you have fast adaptation. And what that means is you're kind of weakening one population quickly, the other one is still resting. So you're kind of bringing the two populations into balance, and this means, so let's say you have a balance beam or something like that, they're kind of coming into balance, and then if you shake the beam in some way, it's more likely that it'll swing the other way. So this was our theory, and there's some psychophysical evidence for this. And so these two facts together suggest that initial activity, the initial size of the activity of that you can show in a population of neurons might predict whether you would get an alternation later on. And to look at these fast processes, we measured electroencephalograms and calculated event-related potentials. And we defined a region of interest, So this is from other research showing neural correlates of consciousness from binocular rivalry. And that suggested that the P1 and the N1 are neural correlates of consciousness. So you get greater activity during binocular rivalry dominance at the P1 and at the N1 than if the image is suppressed. So we defined a region of interest on, and this is in parieto-occipital electrodes. We defined a spatio-temporal region of interest around about there. And the method that we used is called intermittent rivalry. So we showed a rival stimulus for a second. Then we had a gap, a 200 millisecond gap. And then we showed exactly the same rival stimulus again. And a second is enough time, it's more than enough time for one or the other of the two rival stimuli to emerge into consciousness. During the gap, where we just turned off the stimuli, that may or may not perturb consciousness. And then when we show the second one, the second rival stimulus, the question is there a change in perception? Did perception switch at the gap or not? That was the question that we were interested in. And then we had a mask, and then we had blanks and everything. We had numerous trials, as you know, if you're calculating ERPs. And we also had a control condition where we physically changed the stimuli. So I should have mentioned that we chose these times because we knew that on about 50% of trials, perception would change, and on about 50% of trials, perception would not change. And we had control stimuli where we physically changed the stimuli in the first or the second gap, or we didn't change them in the first and the second gap, the first and the second display around the gap. And all we did was we asked our participants to say whether the orientation, the predominant orientation visible at the end of the first display was the same as or different from the predominant orientation at the beginning of the second display. And what we found, sure enough, was 180 milliseconds after the... yes, it is. No? Is this the laser pointer? Okay, here at the N1, the first negative deflection of the ERPs, we see a big difference in the size of the N1 depending on whether consciousness changed. Here, more than a second later, after the second stimulus came on. So the red curve shows the ERPs for when consciousness changed at the gap, and the green curve shows the ERPs when consciousness didn't change at the gap. And we see this difference here. Larger changes when perception changed. So this fit in with our theory. This is from a cluster of 6 parieto-occipital electrodes. And this just shows voltage maps of the difference between those two ERPs for this particular time window. And we see that this is a general, this is not just confined to these particular electrodes, it's a general occipital based. It implies that we have an occipital source for this particular neural electrical event in the brain. And can I do this? No, because I don't have the thing. And here are the results for the control stimuli. So I think I've been saying we, and that's because one of the authors is me. But O'Shea et al. In this experiment found no predictive activity for the physical changes, and I say, whew, because that's really great, because otherwise it would mean that the electrical activity of our participants' brains could predict the mind of the computer, because of course whether it changed or not was just determined by the program of the computer. It suggests it really does have something to do with rivalry rather than just the change in the appearance of things. So, O'Shea et al. Proposed that noise, we don't know why, sometimes the activity is high at the beginning of the, when we first showed the stimuli, and sometimes it's low, we don't know. So this is kind of a role for noise. in determining visual consciousness in this case, and adaptation, because this all kind of fit in with our theory about what would be happening with adaptation, have roles to play in determining the content of visual consciousness. Admittedly, our model's very simple. There's only 2 states, but that's rather nice, I think, rather than a limitation. So we've now done some more work on this, and that's what I want to talk about now. So in this experiment, we wanted to control adaptation by using the phenomenon of flash suppression. So in flash suppression, you present one of the rival stimuli to one eye, and for some duration prior to the first display of the rival stimuli. And when the rival stimuli come on, in this case, horizontal contours have been presented to the left eye. In this case, when these 2 rival stimuli come on, what people report is vertical contours. They report the vertical contours. They report the information visible in the right eye. And so everything after this is just the same as I've just shown you. You have that display, first display, the gap, and the second display, and a mask, and then an ITI. Couldn't fit that on the figure. So we've added this. What we've done is kind of controlled adaptation by using flash suppression. And we did some psychophysics, because this hadn't been done before, to figure out the durations that yielded clear flash suppression, so visibility, consistent visibility of the non-adapted stimulus in the first display of the rival stimuli, and then the gap and the second display, which yielded the duration of the first display and the gap, which yielded about 50-50 of change versus no change. And again, we just asked we did an EEG study with these times, which you'll see on the figures, and we just simply asked our participants to say the same response, what was visible on the at the end of the first display compared with the second display. And lo and behold, and to my astonishment really, we got this exact same N1 difference. So 180 milliseconds after the onset of the flash suppression stimulus, you have a difference that allows you to predict whether perception is going to change, again about a second, just kind of worked out that way, with the parameters we used in the display, which tells you whether perception is going to change at the gap. And here's the voltage map for that. This time we see actually a right hemisphere kind of bias, and that's actually pretty consistent. We often see right hemisphere biases for these processes, but it's a kind of occipital source somewhere, and this just shows that we're again measuring from with these ERPs show occipitoparietal. This is from occipitoparietal electrodes. And here's the control. We had controlled stimuli, of course, again, and there's no difference whatsoever. So again, we found activity consistent with our notions that noise was important and that adaptation was important. Adaptation was kind of in the second part. We controlled adaptation, but nevertheless, there was something 180 milliseconds after the onset, something we could record 180 milliseconds after the onset of the flash suppression stimulus, which told us whether perception would change or not. And this is just some speculation. I'm still thinking about this study, what it actually means, and I'd be grateful for your advice. But a flash suppression stimulus really does involve a form of binocular rivalry. So binocular rivalry, you can define binocular rivalry as presenting different images to the two eyes. So in the flash suppression display, you presented contours to one eye and darkness to the other. And you don't see both, you see one of them. You see the contour, you see it basically forever. But that's not true. If you show that display for 5 minutes, people will eventually report a dark field invading their consciousness, and that's the visibility of the dark field in the other eye. So it is actually a form of rivalry that's going on there. And my suspicion, but this is just a vague hope from a hardcore determinist, that the noise is actually coming from the history of adaptation from the previous trials. But we have no evidence for that at the moment. And these researchers here have published an account of binocular rivalry, which does not rely on adaptation at all, but just simply relies on noise. So there appear to be roles for both noise and adaptation in the contents of visual consciousness that we can use to predict visual consciousness. And we can predict very, very early on, very shortly after the onset of stimuli, whether consciousness will change about a second later. From very, very simple operations, just ERPs, averaging, addition and subtraction, no multivariate classifiers needed or anything like that. So I think my authors, my co-authors, there they all are, and I thank you for your most gracious attention.
All right, marvelous. So the speakers have been fantastic about keeping to time, so we're very grateful for that. I'll begin with questions. Sarah?
What about attention? So during the initial presentation, the observer presumably have fluctuating attention. So what if they were more attentive for some trials?
Well, we didn't manipulate attention in this experiment, but that's a good idea, to try and manipulate attention. What would you predict?
Well, it's possibly for the more attentive trials to get
Yeah.
larger N1, and you may see a faster switching.
Right.
Predicts.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good theory. And I guess if I was going to follow that up, I'd manipulate attention to see if you can see that. And I guess my intuition, my hope, would be that it would actually be independent of attention. But you know that you and I disagree about this.
Question over here.
Actually related to that, within your data set you could look to see if you have pre-stimulus differences in some markers of ongoing fluctuation of attention, like alpha power. And you showed if you look at alpha changes before the onset of the stimulus, that will actually predict
Right.
the magnitude before.
Okay. Okay. No, that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, so if we keep with these short questions, we may get a couple more in there.
So attention has been described occasionally to me as the psychologist's weapon of mass explanation. In this context, I think it's perfectly reasonable that you would actually not expect these things necessarily to be dissociable. If attention in some way involves a modulation of gain, of course it's going to modulate the rate of adaptation. You can have both.
Could you repeat the question?
Comment. We can try and get two more in first in the back and then.
Rob, can you unpack the comment you made about the right hemisphere asymmetry a little bit more, particularly with respect to the parietal electrodes? Exactly how that asymmetry came out?
I'm not sure. And in fact, if I can go back, can I go back? In that first experiment, the first study that I described, you actually see that it's slightly more vigorous on the left hemisphere at the back. And we did source analysis, we did Veretta, and with the settings that we came up with, it produced a source only in the left hemisphere, which was a big surprise because we'd never seen that before. So all these other experiments, and these ones here that I've cited, just about all of those show a greater activation, a bigger difference between dominant and suppressed stimuli at the P1, for example, in the right hemisphere. And we don't know why that is, but it is consistent with various theories about the right hemisphere being a kind of interpreter. This is Paul Corbelis's idea about the right hemisphere interpreter. And kind of normal transmission was resumed in the second study, but in this first study we found, for some reason, greater activity in the in the left hemisphere. So I don't know if that's a very satisfactory answer. We don't know why. It's just something we see consistently.
Final short question.
Yeah, Robert, you just elaborate. What your suggestion is that the greater N1 in those trials that's going to show a flip to the other.
Yeah.
You're suggesting that there's probably greater adaptation that's going to be taking place in those cases
Yeah.
to the flash suppression.
Yeah.
And therefore you're going to tilt the bias to
Yeah.
the
Yeah. That's the idea. That was very easy. Thank you.
Great. Thank our speaker. Yeah. So our next speaker is